In this segment, we'll take a look at the collapse of communism and how did the Cold War come to an end. Both internal and external pressures caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the collapse of the Soviet Union brought an end to the Cold War that had dominated American foreign policy for nearly 45 years. We cannot analyze the end of the Cold War without addressing the role of Ronald Reagan. Reagan turned the Cold War into more of a moral issue for most Americans. That is to say, good versus evil. In fact, in many of Reagan's speeches, he would call the Soviet Union the evil empire. Reagan also put tremendous economic pressure on the Soviet Union in an attempt to simply outspend their economic abilities. In his famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, he turned and pointed at the Soviet Union and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Ronald Reagan was demanding an end to the Cold War. He also put a great deal of pressure on the Soviet Union using the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. Star Wars was part of Reagan's plan for a defensive buildup, and that would try to force the Soviet Union to compete with the United States. And that would hasten or quicken their internal collapse and bring about the end of the Cold War. The SDI, or Star Wars, was designed to protect us against a nuclear attack by having these satellites be kind of a force field around the United States, where we could zap missiles from the Soviet Union before they could hit us. This plan easily outspent the Soviet Union's ability to counter it, and so therefore that brought about an end to the Soviet Union and the Cold War. But there were also many internal problems that were going on within the Soviet Union. Communism, as an economic policy, was simply failing. It could not sustain itself with economic growth. We want to take a look at the specific reasons for the Soviet collapse. We need to consider the political dissidents, that is, those who were speaking out against the government, were challenging the authority of Moscow and the Soviet Union, and where once they were silenced and either murdered or sent away to prisons, now the political dissidents were not being come down as hard on, and so therefore their words began to get out. There was also a great deal of nationalism that was going on in the Soviet republics, and many were seeking to break away from the Soviet Union, literally to secede from that union and become independent countries. There was a great deal of economic inefficiency that was going on as well. There were too many layers of bureaucracy in order to keep up with the demands of the people, and the government was engaged in all types of mismanagement. The economic planners could not anticipate and keep up with the needs of the people. There was a great deal of corruption that was going on at all levels of government, and of course there was also the end of what I call the Stalinites. That is to say, those who were loyal to Joseph Stalin and that old-fashioned brand of Soviet dictatorial communism, well, these guys were dying off. They were simply too old and dying, and a birth of new reformers was coming around. The man who typifies this more than any other was Mikhail Gorbachev. When he became the premier of the Soviet Union, he initiated certain changes that put the Soviet Union on a collision course with the end. One of his major changes was this thing called demokratia. And if you look carefully at this word, if you see the word democracy, you see it. Gorbachev offered free elections between competing communists, where once upon a time the Communist Party would only offer a choice of one person for office. Now Gorbachev was offering multiple choices. Which communist do you like better? While all technically communists, this forced a split in the party. Some were more conservative, some were more liberal, but the party began to split apart. He also offered this thing called glasnost. Glasnost refers to openness in government. Rather than engaging in the incredibly strict censorship, the people only know what the party approves of, glasnost allowed other information to come out, both inside the country as well as outside the country. Under Glasnost, the Soviet Union actually opened up its borders a little bit and allowed foreigners to come in to visit. Perestroika was an attack on the old communist system of the economy. This allowed some capitalism, some areas of the free market economy, and a complete economic restructuring. While people still had their regular communist jobs, they were now permitted to work extra jobs, engage in barter, and actually make more money. During this time, we also have the establishment of the independent states. While Gorbachev was premier, certain nations began to split off. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania began to declare their independence, and rather than move in with force, Gorbachev said goodbye and good luck. Other events were going on around the world at the time, which also parallel the breakup of the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union and its influence began to stop, the Warsaw Pact completely dissolved. In fact, nations that had been involved in the Warsaw Pact left and joined NATO. We also have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. That meant the reunification of Germany. And with that, non-totalitarian governments began springing up all along Eastern Europe. And this meant an end to the Soviet presence and the Soviet force of their regimes, and now democracy was gaining a strong foothold. What was really meant by the end? As the Soviet Union split apart and Mikhail Gorbachev renounced his leadership and resigned, the Soviet Union created what was called the Commonwealth of Independent States. This was going to be a temporary nation that was set up to serve as kind of the governing board as the Soviet Union split apart, with a design to let these nations go, become independent, but be friendly with each other. The collapse of the Soviet Union opened up many new problems for the United States. Whereas once upon a time we had one monolithic enemy who we could point to on a map, now it was time to build a new world without the Soviet Union, without their challenge, but also without their influence. And what this meant for the United States, as the remaining superpower, the United States struggles to establish a consistent policy in a world that's rapidly changing and increasingly interdependent. There are many forces that are going against what we would consider to be global unity. Throughout the world, we find ethnic and religious factionalism, where people are challenging each other based on their ethnic and religious beliefs. We also see a great deal of economic disparity. We see areas where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and all the problems that are associated with that. We also have an increase of nuclear proliferation, where once upon a time the United States had its missiles, the Soviet Union had its missiles, and we knew where ours were, they knew where theirs were, and everything was kept peaceful. Now more and more nations have nuclear abilities, which causes a significant problem, much more to keep track of, and also much more potential for problems to occur. And also we've seen an incredible increase in terrorism, which we will address in modules later on. And so the ultimate question for us, what role should the United States play in this new world order? Where do we make our stands? Where do we let things go? How much are we willing to put out to ensure that the world is safe for democracy?